Hello and welcome back. If somebody came up to us and said, can you tell me about a few features of why we would use vSphere? After this demonstration and this discussion of features, you'll be able to. Now, what we're also going to do as we proceed through this journey together, I'll walk you through how to configure most of these features as we step through them one by one. But to start off, we could first of all say, well, for vSphere, what exactly it is, it's ESXi hosts, the hypervisors running on hardware, and each of those ESXi hosts can be supporting virtual machines, and then we can manage it all with vCenter. And that's the magic that makes many of these features possible, is a combination of those two core components of vSphere. So for these discussions and for the demonstrations, I'll be using vCenter to do it, and to connect to and work with vCenter, they refer to that, VMware refers to that as the vSphere client. So when somebody says the vSphere client, we're connecting to the vCenter server to manage our enterprise. If somebody says the VMware host client, we're connecting just to one individual ESXi host directly. So the first feature I'd like to chat with you about is a cookie cutter. And you might be saying, Keith, what do you mean a cookie cutter? Well, if we're going to make a whole bunch of cookies and make them identical or virtually identical, we use a cookie cutter. Pop, 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 and put them in the oven, away we go. They're all going to be almost the same. Well, if we have a virtual machine that we need to create, and maybe we need to create 20 or 30 or 40 or 100 of them, wouldn't it be great if we could make a cookie cutter approach to that? Well, we can, using a feature called a template. So we can create a template, and I'll show you how to exactly do that as we get to that part of these videos. But we can take a template, which is like a perfect image or a perfect cookie cutter for the VMs that we want to create, and then we hit the button, go, 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 and just boop, 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 create the VMs. It's that easy. All right, so let me demonstrate how easy it is to create a new VM in vSphere using a template. And this is the vSphere client. I'm connected to vCenter with this browser window, and I've got a template already created that we're simply going to leverage. So I'm going to click over here on VMs and templates, this icon right there. And I've got a template called T-DSL, named it myself. And if we click on this T-DSL, it is a template. And if we scroll down, it'll show us details about it. So regarding this template, if we create new VMs, they'll have one virtual CPU each. They'll each be given one logical gigabyte of disk storage. And thin provision, what that means is that if the device, the virtual machine, doesn't really use the full gig, it won't waste that much space. So in this case, if it's using like 254 megabytes of that gig, it'll only really tie up 254 megabytes of storage that the ESXi host has. All right, so to create a new virtual machine, we would just right-click on this template, and this is using the vSphere client. We're connected to vCenter to do this, and we simply, from the drop-down, use this option right here, create a new virtual machine from this template. It wants us to give it a name. Let's call it DSL for darn small Linux, which is what it is. And let's call it 11. It's also asking us, where do you want to put this? And so I've got some folders. I've got one for Linux just for organization purposes. So it'll create the new virtual machine in this folder called Linux. We'll click on Next. Next, it's asking about a compute resource. Effectively, it's saying, which ESXi host do you want to run this on? Now, there's another feature called DRS, which stands for Distributed Resource Scheduler, that if it's enabled, and this represents right here, this represents a cluster. Think of a cluster like a group, because that's exactly what it is. So on this cluster, if we enable this feature called Distributed Resource Scheduler, we could just tell vCenter, yeah, let's go ahead and place it right here in prod 1, that cluster, and then DRS can identify, who's the least busy of these ESXi hosts, and whoever is the least busy will then be responsible for providing the compute resource for that VM. Because at the end of the day, somebody's got to have CPU for a running virtual machine. It's going to be one of these 3 ESXi hosts if we drop it on prod. Or we could just say we want it on a specific ESXi host. So for the demo, let's go ahead and specify we want ESXi1 to be the host that's going to provide these CPU resources for this new virtual machine. So with that decided, we'll click on ESXi1. We'll click on Next. Next, it's asking about what storage resources on ESXi1 that we want to use. I'm going to go ahead and specify this SSD drive. And as far as the virtual disk format, I'm going to say thin provision, which means, hey, if this virtual machine is allocated a gig of hard disk space, but it's only using 500 megabytes, just don't tie up more than 500 megabytes. And that's the key story behind thin provisioning. So with that selected, let's go ahead and click on Next. Then it's asking, okay, after I create this virtual machine, what do you want to do? Do you want to go ahead and power it on? Do you want to further customize it? And I'm going to go ahead and say, let's just power it on. And we'll click on next. And there's a summary of what it's going to do. And we'll click on finish. And while it's doing that, let's go ahead and create another one. So right click on the template, say new VM from this template. We'll make this DSL-12. We'll put that logically in the Linux container because it is Linux, and next. And then we'll put it in the production cluster, specifically on ESXi2, and click on next. I'm going to tell it to use that data store. A data store is a fancy way for saying the storage on an ESXi host, or the storage that the ESXi host can reach. And I'm going to say thin provisioning, and click on next. And then go back one step and just check that real quick. Yeah. Looks good. And then we'll click on power that guy on as well. And bada bing, bada boom. So those guys are off to the races. Now, just to check real quick, we could go back here to Linux. Look at that. That little arrow, that green arrow. And also there's two themes here. We could, if you don't like the bright theme, we could also go up to our login information up here and say switch theme. And that takes us to dark. Either way is great. I may switch back and forth between those. So here in dark mode, here's DSL 11 and 12. And if we click on them, it'll give us the details. I'm going to switch back to light mode because some of the indicators are easier to see in light mode, in my opinion. But when we get into the labs, you can go ahead and switch it back and forth with whatever way works best for you. So it's stating that this virtual machine doesn't have VMware tools installed. That's okay for now. I just got a really lightweight virtual machine. So it shows it's powered on, and it's using 96 megabytes of memory, which is so teeny. And it has 462 megabytes of storage tied up, but it can go up to a little over a gig there. And it's also connected to the network. So if we wanted to open up a window and connect to that virtual machine, we can do it right here from the vSphere client. And one way of doing it would be to right here launch the remote console, which I have enabled, or we could launch a web console without VMware tools, which we'll talk about more in a separate video. Without VMware tools, mouse and keyboard activity in a VM is a nightmare. So I'm going to choose the launch remote console option. And that's opening up in a separate window, which I'll bring right over here. And then I'll go ahead and log in as DSL. Supply the super secret password, and away it goes. And let me move this up so we can see it a little bit better. So here is this virtual machine. And if we want to, I think I've got a couple things queued up. Yeah, I like fireworks. Boom. Here's fireworks. And over here on the right, it's showing the IP address it has. And we can bring up a terminal and verify we can get out to the internet. So I'm going to type in SU to be King Kong for a minute here. Resupply the password. And let's do a ping to www.vmware.com. That'll be a continuous ping. And away it goes. So it's pinging away out to the internet. We have fireworks going on in the background. We have CPU utilization for this virtual machine up here. Now here's the kicker. This virtual machine thinks it's using 26% of its CPU, or now 30, if that's moving right here, so I'll circle it so we can see it. So it believes that's how much of its CPU it's using, but in the background, it's just getting a little slice from a much bigger operating system, from the hypervisor, who has lots and lots of CPU available. It thinks it's using around 19. Here's what it thinks it's using for RAM. It thinks it's using about 19.9 meg of the 124 meg, about 16%. So templates is just one of many benefits in the world of VMware's vSphere. Another feature that I mentioned a moment ago was DRS. And DRS, the Distributed Resource Scheduler at the cluster level, is amazing, because if we create new VMs and we just I want to put them in prod and let DRS, Distributed Resource Scheduler, act like effectively a decision point to determine which of these ESXi hosts are least busy or most appropriate, and it could then go ahead and deploy the virtual machine on the appropriate host. So if this guy was at 50% utilization, and this guy was at 30% utilization, and this guy was doing nothing, it's very likely that DRS is going to say for a new virtual machine, hey, let's go ahead and put it on ESXi3. Another feature of DRS is that, let's imagine that we have 10 VMs on each host. So it's evenly distributed, they're all running. And then these, let's say 5 or 6 of these on ESXi1 get really busy. The servers start using tons and tons of resources, compute resources, where this guy now goes to 90% utilization, and maybe ESXi2 and 3 are both at 30%. With DRS, we can set it up to automatically real-time move virtual machines off of ESXi1 and over to ESXi2 or 3, other ESXi hosts in the cluster, which can help avoid the bottleneck that's happening on ESXi1. And with DRS, we can set that up to be automatic, or we can have it do suggestions. And the difference between fully automated and suggestion is that fully automated will just do it. It'll just move those VMs, and I'm talking hot. It'll move running virtual machines from one ESXi host over to another one with virtually no interruption. And that's if we have DRS, Distributed Resource Scheduler, set up for auto. If we set up DRS, Distributed Resource Scheduler, to suggest mode, it'll go ahead and tell us, hey, you could probably move this VM off of here to there, and that would help, evenly balance the workload across your 3 hosts or however many you have in the cluster. And that's the primary difference between auto and suggest. One does it for you, and one just says you may want to do this. Now, how in the world does it move virtual machines between ESXi hosts? And the answer is vMotion, yet another fantastic feature. And with vMotion, it's also referred to as migrate, because we're migrating from one host to the other for a virtual machine. So if we have a virtual machine that was currently supported by ESXi1 and we want to move to ESXi3, we can migrate it. If it's running, it's referred to as vMotion. So we can move the compute resource. We also can migrate or move storage. Because if we have shared storage that these ESXi hosts can all reach, we might leave the storage in the same place, like the virtual hard drive that VM is using, and just move that VM to a different compute resource. In fact, you know what? We can do it. I've got that VM that's currently running. This guy right here, DS11, is running on ESXi1. He's up and running, doing a continuous ping. So let's go ahead and demonstrate with vMotion moving DSL11, that virtual machine, which is currently on ESXi1, and let's move it down to ESXi3. And so on DSL11, if we scroll down a little bit, here under related objects, it has the cluster it's in, the ESXi host that it's using, and the network it's connected to. So it's currently on ESXi1. If we wanted to move that to ESXi2, we could right-click on this virtual machine. We could then click on Migrate, which is going to allow us to migrate the computing resource that this guy's currently on, or the storage, or both. So we'll click on Migrate, which effectively is vMotion. So here's our options. Do you want to change just the compute resource, just the storage, or do you want to change both the compute and the storage? So for this quick demo, I'm going to go ahead and change both of them from ESXi1 for compute and storage over to ESXi3. And we'll click on Next. Then it's asking where do I want to go ahead and send it. So we'll expand prod, and I want to drop him and move him over to ESXi3. We'll click on Next. And then it's saying, okay, over on ESXi3, he's got a couple options for storage. We'll choose the SSD one. And for this vMotion, I'm going to go ahead and say thin provision. Actually, it's already thin provisioned, so I'm going to just err on the side of caution and say thin provisioned again as we move him and click on Next. So this computer is currently using a network called VM Network, and both ESXi1 and ESXi3 have it, so I'm going to leave that as is. So effectively, the networking won't change from the perspective of the virtual machine. We'll click on Next. Then it's asking me if I want to schedule it with high priority, like get it done now, or schedule with normal vMotion priority. So before I launch that, let's go back to the virtual machine. So here's the virtual machine, and it's still running. Happy, happy, happy. I got fireworks going on in the background, and let's go ahead and migrate it. All right, and let's go ahead and click on Next. Here's a summary, and click on Finish. All right, it's off to the races. All right, and I think it is done. So let's go ahead and scroll down. Actually, let me click on refresh here and scroll down. And look at this. It now says it's running on ESXi3. That's the host supporting that VM. And if we go back to that VM, and I'll do a Control-C to stop the pings. If we scroll up, I'm just looking for a hiccup. Oh, there we go. It might have been right here. So its average ping delay was 7.5 milliseconds, and right here was 13 milliseconds. So what's 8 milliseconds between friends? But it's very likely it happened right there. So the key here, the key takeaway is from this VM, from its perspective, it didn't even know or care that it happened. It had continued functionality the entire process. So that's an example of another feature of vSphere, and that is vMotion. So we'll have more opportunity as we continue together to both understand those concepts better and also to set them up and verify they work in the lab. All right, so to finish off this video, though, I did want to talk about a few other features that are really amazing in the world of vSphere. All right, let me keep myself on track here. So we have templates we've talked about, which are like cookie cutters, vMotion, which can move a virtual machine from here over to here. And in the interface, that was referred to as a migrate, and that's vMotion, and it can be done on a running virtual machine, or it can be also done, not quite as dramatic, on a virtual machine that's not running. That also works. We also talked about DRS, Distributed Resource Scheduler, which can take a look at the utilization of ES6i hosts in a cluster. And then DRS, based on utilization, can move virtual machines from one ES6i host to a different ES6i host to more evenly and more fairly distribute the load. And that can help reduce bottlenecks. All right, so let's continue with some features. Another feature is vSphere high availability. Let's imagine we had a VM that was so important to our organization that, let's say it's running an email server or a web server or something else. And if it failed, if it went down or had a problem, we'd want to go ahead and restart that virtual machine on another ES6i host so it would be up and running again. And that feature is called vSphere HA for high availability. And the way that works is with heartbeats. Think of a heartbeat like, how you doing? So let's bring this VM back for a moment. If we set this virtual machine up with high availability, we'd be doing consistent how are you messages to that virtual machine. And if that virtual machine doesn't respond, we're going to assume, oh, not good. Because the VM is no longer responding to the heartbeats, vCenter can say, whoa, that guy is no longer responding. That VM isn't, we better bring him up on a separate ESXi host. And that's one of the benefits of having vCenter at the heart, no pun intended, of our management system, so it can use features like vSphere HA to identify a failed VM. In addition to high availability with vSphere, there's also an option called proactive, which sounds great, and it is. Proactive is like, hey, something bad is coming. Let's go ahead and fix it. So if we have, let's say we have a rack server from HP or Dell or somebody else, and they've got some software that's monitoring their power supplies and other gear, that can be fed into vCenter. Let's use an example where a device has power supply A and power supply B. And one of the power supplies is failing, or the heat is rising, and the vendor's monitoring on that device can report that to vCenter server, and vCenter can say, whoa, okay, you know what? I'm going to be proactive, and I'm going to move virtual machines off of this ESXi host that's failing or could be failing over to another ESXi host in that cluster before that system completely fails. And that's why it's referred to as proactive HA. Another feature that can help protect critical VMs is called FT, or fault tolerance. And what fault tolerance means is where if we have a critical system, let's say it's this guy right here. This VM is so critical to us that it can't afford to be down. What we can do is we can run it here on ESXi2 and also run it here on ESXi1 and synchronize. So one of them that is actually doing the work, but they're synchronizing all the data back and forth between those two. So if anything happens to ESXi2 or this VM, immediately this guy is up and running and available as virtually that same VM because it's running it twice. And that's the feature called fault tolerance, where we run that VM twice. Now, besides having fault tolerance and high availability for VMs, we also have some high availability and fault tolerance and backup options regarding the vCenter server itself, because this guy is running as a VM. And so by backing up the vCenter server appliance data, if we have a problem, we can restore from that data and hopefully get back up and running as soon as possible. Now, above and beyond just backing it up, we also have some HA, high availability, for the vCenter server as well. And it's called vCenter HA. And with vCenter high availability, we're going to use multiple hosts, 3 at least, in a cluster to support that. And I'll include the nitty-gritty in the respective set of videos regarding vCenter high availability. But as far as the feature goes, it's important to know that the vice president that's in charge of managing all the managers who are in charge of managing all the virtual machines or the employees, it's important to know that we have several options for protecting that device and helping ensure uptime. And that's because we don't want to lose access to our vCenter and lose that functionality, because if we do, that means we've also lost manageability of our entire vSphere enterprise. At least from a global perspective. We can still use the host client and go to individual ESXi hosts, and sometimes we might have to if we're troubleshooting, but ideally we want to do all of our management via the vCenter server. And let me tell you about 2 last features, and then we'll close this video. And they are amazing. One is called host profiles. And associated with that, the ability, and with host profiles, referring to ESXi hosts, we can set up profiles, and then we can verify that all the ESXi hosts are conforming with that host profile. And that way we can help measure drift, like, okay, why is ESXi3 behaving slightly differently? Why isn't he the same? It makes it a lot easier to verify the compliance and the details for a bunch of ESXi hosts without having to go to each one manually. There's also the options with vSphere 7 to go ahead and say what images we want to use for the hosts inside of a cluster. And that way, when it comes time to upgrade the version of the ESXi host software that's running on them, we can also, through Lifecycle Manager, easily identify what versions we're on and also fairly easily upgrade dozens or hundreds or thousands of ESXi hosts up to that exact version of code that we want for those ESXi hosts. All right, and then the last thing I want to chat about is content libraries, which are amazing. I mean, in a large environment, it's important to have the right software and then be able to access that software. So in vSphere, we can create content libraries that can have ISOs or scripts or other software that we need available across the environment. And the benefit of the content library is that we can have that content that's important to us, ISOs, scripts, images, and so forth. And we can create a content library and publish it. And then other parts of our organization can go ahead and they can subscribe to it, which basically means they can get access to whatever we've published. So it's a fantastic way for making VMware-related content that we're going to need for our infrastructure available across the entire vSphere infrastructure. In this video, we've taken a look at a few of the features inside of a vSphere environment. Now, not all features are going to be available to everybody. And you might ask, well, Keith, why is that? And the answer is because not everybody has the same license for all the features. So in the next video, I'd like to direct your attention to the additions of vSphere that we can get, and also direct your attention to where you can get details on which features are included based on which edition of vSphere that you've purchased. And we'll do that in the next video. So I'll see you there in just a moment.